Hi everybody, it's Sarah from Hushed Up History. When you say Salem, Massachusetts, there is one chapter in particular that jumps to the forefront of everyone's mind. The Salem Witch Trials. We're not going to talk about the famous story of the man who was crushed to death, and we're not going to go super deep into any of the 19 victims that were hanged. Sarah Osborne, Roger Toothaker, Ann Foster, Lydia Dustin. One more soul who died in prison during the Salem Witch Trials. Her name is Dorothy Good, and she entered jail and died in jail as an infant. There was also Sarah's older daughter, Dorothy Good, and it is Dorothy Good who has a story that many people consider to be one of the most tragic tales to come out of the Salem Witch Trials. And up until recently, it was also incomplete. To fully understand the story of Dorothy Good, we have to go backwards a little bit and talk about her mother, Sarah Good. Sarah Good was born in Wenham, Massachusetts in the 1650s, and the early portion of her life seems relatively calm. Her father, John Solart, ran a successful tavern, and the family was doing well. But everything took a horrific turn for the Good family when John Solart drowned himself in 1672. At the time of his death, Sarah's father did not have a will, so when her mother remarried, her new stepfather took control of everything, and he kept nearly everything from Sarah and her siblings. What little she did have was lost in her two marriages, first to an indentured servant named Daniel Poole, who died relatively soon, and then to a laborer named William Good, who had a hard time staying employed. All of this put Sarah Good in a place that by 1692, she had nothing. The Goods were essentially homeless, and Sarah paced up and down the streets of Salem begging for some form of help, some kind of charity. But people were very hesitant to help Sarah Good. She was very bitter, she was very angry, she was very aggressive, and as she walked through the streets smoking her pipe, she muttered and cursed at anyone who refused to help her. Alongside her, during these days of begging, was her daughter, Dorothy. When the accusations started flying, Sarah Good was the prime target, the easiest of easy targets to accuse of witchcraft. And when her name was stated by the accusing girls, it started a series of events that would tear the already fragile Good family apart at the seams. Her arrest warrant was issued alongside Sarah Osborne and Tituba for suspicions of witchcraft, for, quote, much mischief done Elizabeth Parris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam, and Elizabeth Hubbard. She was accused by the girls of biting them, pinching them, choking them, and trying to get them to sign the Devil's Book. When Sarah Good was brought to the Salem Village Meeting House, there was very little she could do to change the minds of the people there that she was not a witch. And at the end of her examination, she was transferred and held at several locations before finally being imprisoned in jail in Boston. And imprisoned along with her was her 1-month-old infant, Dorothy Good. Sarah Good was arrested on March 1st, 1692. And on March 23rd, 1692, an arrest warrant was issued for her daughter, Dorothy Good. Dorothy Good, at the time of her arrest, was 4 years old. 4 years old. 4 years old. The magistrates of Salem, Massachusetts had now just arrested and accused a 4-year-old girl for the crime of witchcraft, but that did not matter to them. It did not matter at all, because the next day, on March 24th, 1692, little Dorothy Good was taken to the Salem Village Meeting House and stood in front of the masses and subjected to brutal questioning. At one point, the magistrates would hold her head firmly in place and move it so that she would look at specific people in the courtroom. And everyone there would try to take notice if wherever her gaze met, if that person then became tormented by her witchcraft. And these torments that this girl was being accused of were outrageous. Ann Putnam, Mary Walcott, and Mercy Lewis all said that Dorothy Good regularly pinched them, bit them, poked at them, choked them, and tried to get them to sign their name in the Devil's Book. I do just want to point out real quick, sometimes when you're hearing the story of Dorothy, you'll hear her referred to as Dorcas Good. This was a mistake. A magistrate wrote her name wrong in a record, and it's been filtered down throughout history in countless sources, but her name is Dorothy Good. It was a common theme in many accusations that these accused witches had some sort of connection to an animal, either an animal familiar that would do their bidding, or they could transform into an animal shape. And this came into play during Dorothy Good's questioning on March 26th, 1692. It was on March 26th, 1692, that the more than likely completely exhausted and completely terrified Dorothy Good started to tell the magistrates about a little snake that she had. She told them that she had a little snake, and that this little snake fed off of her from a spot on her hand. When the magistrate started asking her and pointing to her hand, does it feed from here? Does it feed from here? She corrected them, saying, no, it feeds from here, and pointed to a spot on her hand that had a small red welt. The magistrates took this as a sign that Dorothy had a witch's familiar, and when they asked her where she got the snake from, Dorothy told them she got it from her mother. Dorothy Good was questioned multiple times, and by April, she was reunited with her mother and her infant sister in prison. Imprisoned. Salem, Massachusetts, the magistrates of Salem, Massachusetts, had now decided to imprison a 4-year-old under the assumption of witchcraft. When she got to the prison, they didn't even have shackles to fit her. They had to be custom made to fit around her tiny wrists and ankles. And once she was in prison, she was subjected to every form of horror that existed behind those walls, including being there to witness the death of her infant sister and seeing her mother dragged out of her cell for the last time before she was executed. Dorothy remained in jail alone until December of 1692. Now, this was after the Court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, and it was decided that she could be released, but somebody had to pay her bill. Finally, a Salem man by the name of Samuel Ray paid her bill, and on December 10th, 1692, Dorothy Good was released. For centuries, we believed that this is where the story of Dorothy Good ended, that she was released from prison, and due to the severe trauma she experienced there, she was driven to insanity and died at a very young age. However, in 2022, that all changed. The information and the story that I'm about to tell you is 100% because of the research of Rachel Christ Doan of the Salem Witch Museum. So, huge shout out to Rachel Christ Doan and the entire Department of Education at the Salem Witch Museum. It is because of their research that we know this information, and they literally gave Dorothy Good her life back. William Good, Dorothy's father, was around. He was alive during her imprisonment and after her release, and up until now, he has not had a kind light shined upon him. A document that was found shows that he petitioned the crown for reparations to get money to pay him for the suffering that his family endured during the Salem Witch Trials. It reads, quote, September 13th, 1710. To the Honorable Committee, the humble representation of William Good of the damages sustained by him in the year 1692 by reason of the suffrage of his family upon the account of supposed witchcraft. 1. My wife Sarah Good was in prison about 4 months and then executed. 2. A child died in prison before the mother's execution. 3. A child of 4 or 5 years old was in prison 7 or 8 months, and being chained in the dungeon, was so hardly used and terrified that she hath ever since been very chargeable, having little or no reason to govern herself. And I leave it unto the honorable court to judge what damages I have sustained by such a destruction of my poor family in so rest. Your Honor's humble servant, William Good, Salem. William Good petitioning the crown and asking for money to pay him for what he suffered with his wife and children during the Salem Witch Trials might initially look pretty terrible. But when he is issued the money, in 1712, he asks that the payment be given to a man named Benjamin Putnam, and he asks that it be given to Benjamin Putnam to pay for the care of Dorothy Good. Dorothy's initial time immediately out of prison is a little murky. It is believed that she may have had to move from house to house, but at some point, she was taken in by Benjamin Putnam, who cared for her. We know at this point in 1712 that she had been living in his care, but records indicate that she may have been living in the Benjamin Putnam household as early as 1708. There is also a possibility that she was living in the home of Benjamin Putnam much earlier in life for some point of time. There are accounts written in the 1800s that talk about when Dorothy had to be taken to her examination, that someone had to go get her and carry her to the meeting house because, quote, the little thing wouldn't have been able to make the walk from Benjamin Putnam's farm. Now, I know the initial thought, what do you mean she's in a house of Benjamin Putnam? Why is she in a Putnam house? Aren't the Putnams the bad guys of the Salem Witch Trials? Here's what happens with this. The Putnam family was very large, and they were split. During the time of the Salem Witch Trials, there were the Putnams that were heavily involved in accusations and caused a tremendous amount of damage to families during the Salem Witch Trials. But there were also members of the Putnam family that were against the Salem Witch Trials, and Benjamin Putnam was greatly outside of the beliefs of his family members who were viciously going after people and accusing them of witchcraft. Dorothy Good was living in the care of Benjamin Putnam, who was being paid for her care. When he died in 1715, her care was transferred to his son, Nathaniel Putnam, in 1716. After 1716, we lose track of Dorothy Good for 4 years until her name reappears in records in 1720. And unfortunately, it was not for a great reason. In 1720, the selectmen of Salem decreed that Dorothy Good was to be warned out of town, which meant that she was essentially being kicked out, that the town felt that they could not afford to care for her, that she had to go find somewhere else to go. But 2 months after she is warned out of town, she again appears in records, with payments being made to Nathaniel Putnam for the care of Dorothy and Dorothy's child. Dorothy Good had a child, and it's possible that this is the reason that she was initially warned out of town. But with Nathaniel, offering to take care of her, she was allowed to stay, and she remained in the household of Nathaniel Putnam for another 2 years. During this time, Dorothy has a daughter that she also names Dorothy, and Dorothy's daughter is contracted to be an indentured servant for Nathaniel Putnam's household. This is a relatively common practice. Dorothy's daughter will be clothed, she will be fed, she will be trained as a domestic servant while living in the Putnam household. At the same time, her mother will be living at the same address, still under Nathaniel Putnam's care. It may have seemed that Dorothy finally found a stable place to live, but this was not the case. Before her daughter's indenture was finalized, arrangements were made for the senior Dorothy to live under the care of Robert Hutchinson, who was Nathaniel Putnam's brother-in-law. But she never made it to Hutchinson's house. And that is because in 1722, Dorothy Good's name appears as living in a house of corrections. Now, the House of Corrections at this time in Salem was relatively new. The building had only been constructed a couple of years beforehand, and it wasn't so much a jail as it was a workhouse. However, it was located very closely to some of the buildings that Dorothy had to endure when she was imprisoned as a child. We do not know why Dorothy Good ended up in the House of Corrections. What we do know is that she spent 18 weeks there, and upon her release, she was due to go back into the care of Robert Hutchinson. And this time, she did get to Hutchinson's house, but she was only there for 3 months before she disappears from record again, this time with no indication of her activity for 3 years. In 1725, Dorothy Good appears on records as being held in a House of Corrections, and again, we are unsure as to why she was in the House of Corrections, but the mystery of Dorothy Good in the year of 1725 was far from over. In June of 1725, somehow Dorothy Good ended up in Concord, Massachusetts, and while she was there, she had a son. Records indicate that payments were made to a man named Nathaniel Billings, who took her into his home to help care for her and her newborn after he was born. Within a couple of months, Dorothy Good and her newborn son, William, were back in Salem, Massachusetts, and they were moving from house to house, living in home to home, and eventually did end up in the house owned by the son of Robert Hutchinson. But that also didn't last. He died 6 months later, and that is when Dorothy and her newborn son William ended up in the home of Jonathan Batchelder. And this may have been a little awkward, because Jonathan Batchelder, at 14 years old, had testified against Dorothy's mother, Sarah, during the Salem Witch Trials. But somehow, it worked out. Dorothy lived in the home of Jonathan Batchelder for a decade, and her son, William, was contracted to be an indentured servant to Jonathan Batchelder until the age of 21. In the records of her living with Jonathan Batchelder, we may also have a hint as to how she ended up in Concord, Massachusetts. Part of the agreement was that Jonathan Batchelder would take care of Dorothy Good in order to prevent her from, quote, straying and rambling about as formerly. 6 years into her stay with Batchelder, he was granted a large payment to cover the extraordinary cost of Dorothy's care. The last official records we have of Dorothy Good show her name appearing in selectmen records in 1738. At this point, she would have been 50 years old, and this was 2 years before the death of Jonathan Batchelder. It is at this point that the story of the Goods fade into mystery. There are no further official records about Dorothy Good. There are also no known records of her daughter, Dorothy, or her son, William. Although we will probably never definitively know what happened to Dorothy Good, there is one very tiny hint that might give us an idea as to what happened to her in her final days. In 1761, a newspaper out of New London, Connecticut, printed a small story about the body of a transient woman that was found deceased in a bog. And in this small story, they named this woman as Dorothy Good. We will never know if this was in fact the body of Dorothy Good. We can only speculate. What we do know is that she had a history of wandering away, so she may have found herself in New London, Connecticut at the end of her life. We do know that the last name Good was not common in the region at the time. And then there is the curious point that this tiny little story about the body of a transient woman being found in a bog was reprinted in 2 newspapers in Boston, Massachusetts. The life of Dorothy Good is one filled with tragedy and mystery, but up until recently, it was also believed to have been cut tragically short. Due to the work of Rachel Christ Doan and the Education Department of the Salem Witch Museum, we can now have a little bit of light shed on her dark and tragic tale. Dorothy Good made it out of prison, but Dorothy Good also lived. There are thousands of stories that come out of the Salem Witch Trials and all of Salem's long and fascinating history, and I highly encourage you to go there and visit at any point during the year. Visit the museums, talk to the locals, eat at some of the incredible restaurants, take a tour, and learn these stories for yourself. I also ask you to take one thing into consideration. They show up every Halloween, every year, and not just in Salem, in every online marketplace, every online retailer, looking to make a couple extra dollars on what they feel is a fun, witty saying about the spooky season. So I ask you this. Next Halloween, or before or after, at any point that you encounter these, before you agree to purchase any t-shirts or any items that have sayings on them like this, take a second, think about it, think about this story, and ask yourself if wearing these is a good idea. Thanks for listening, everybody, and I will see you again soon for more stories from Hushed Up History.